This is today's Cyntegrity's webinar about KRIs in clinical trials, best practices. I'm your host, Linda Bunschoten. I'm the Global Director of Marketing. The webinar will take about 60 minutes and we will close with a Q&A with our speakers. Next slide, please. As you can see on your right-hand side, this webinar is designed to be interactive. It works best when you are involved, so please feel free to submit questions using the chat box. It's located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, leave a message using the chat panel. The session is recorded, and after our session, we will make it available for your download. Next slide, please. Maybe some of you are already aware who we are, but for those who aren't, Cyntegrity is headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany, and we deliver and develop intelligent risk-based monitoring cloud applications and services to the life sciences industry in the broadest sense. We have been developing specialized solutions for clinical trials since 2013. Next slide, please. The speakers for today's event are, first of all, Dr. Nimita Limaye. She holds a PhD biotechnology and she is a Lean Six Sigma black belt and an expert in risk-based monitoring. 20+ years of experience across the pharma and CRO industry, and she has held various leadership positions at big companies in the industry and has also led global RBM operations. Currently, we have the honor to have Nimita on board heading our KRI Wiki project, and she will explain more about it later. Next slide, please. Our second speaker for today is Artem Andrianov. Artem holds a PhD in mathematics, but not only a PhD in mathematics, he is also a master in business administration, finance, and corporate strategy. During his studies, he did various research projects in companies like GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, and ERT. Currently, he is heading Cyntegrity in the role of CEO. Next slide, please. And now I have the honor to hand over the presentation rights to my colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to pass control of the live demonstration over to Nimita and Artem, and you may start your presentation whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, very much for this kind introduction. Nimita, I can say that our presentation will be consisting of two parts. The first part will be presented by Nimita, and do you want to take the leadership, Nimita?
Sure. Thank you so much, Artem, and thank you very much, Linda. It's indeed a privilege to be here, be invited by Cyntegrity and Artem to co-lead this webinar. So heading straight on for the presentation on the KRI story. Firstly, thank you very much to everyone who is on this call for making the time. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay, super. So we're going to speak about KRIs, and when we're talking about KRIs, the intent of this presentation is really not to go into the very basics, but to explore some of the complexities and the challenges that lie with KRIs. When we're speaking about risk-based monitoring, it has multiple aspects. such as it has multiple aspects such as technology, the core clinical and risk-based monitoring domain expertise, the fundamental pillars on which stand, that is technology. But I feel that a very, very strong piece, a very strong element of risk-based monitoring are the key risk indicators. So what's a key risk indicator? When you're out for a drive, you see your fuel tank getting empty. You're getting a red signal out there. That's a key risk indicator, right? So what is a KRI? It's basically an objective measurement of a study-related parameter. You're trying to objectively track certain parameters. You're having predefined thresholds out there. And they're basically digital triggers which are telling you what's wrong. I think we have a very experienced audience out here. So I'm not going to start with an explanation of what is risk-based monitoring and what are the advantages of it. But KRIs are a very, very core piece of the risk-based monitoring story. Next, Artem, you have the control of the slides, right? Yeah, thank you very much, Artem. So the very first question that one has when basically implementing an RBM study is how many Co-KRIs should we have? So one should not really forget the fundamental term key risk indicators. So when you're looking at key risk indicators, a lot of people build a lot of KRI libraries, and you have to have an in-depth library to cover potential KRIs. But at the same time, what you really need to look at is what is specific to your study. Otherwise, you're losing out on the term key and you're diluting your entire efforts, because if you're going to invest time and effort in chasing every possible risk, then you might as well be visiting the site every day and following your traditional monitoring strategy. So focus on the key. When you're talking about key risk indicators, you have different types of risk indicators again. So you have the basic or the generic set of risk indicators, which would be traditionally applicable to most studies across the spectrum. Then you again have study-specific risk indicators. As you know, each and every study is different. So you go down to look at those parameters that are unique to a particular study and which would really hike up the risk for that study as well. You also can create a therapeutic area library of key risk indicators. So for example, for oncology studies, CNS studies, and so on and so forth. There are certain risks associated with each different type of therapeutic indication, and it is certainly beneficial as one works one's way through various types of studies to start building a repository of key risk indicators specific to certain therapeutic areas, specific to certain molecule types, and so on and so forth. Again, as one starts looking at the complexity of risk of the study, one definitely needs to focus upon the patient population. Is it a vulnerable patient population? Is it a compromised patient population? Is it a pediatric study that we are doing out here? And all of these parameters would instantly hike up the risk. So there are various angles that one needs to look at, and one has to focus upon what's the ideal number of KRIs that one wants to define for one study. Next slide, please. So it is always a tricky task. I don't think there is a magic number that one can say you should have 20 or you should have 50. I think it's something that's carefully looked at and judged on a case-to-case basis. The average industry standard is said to be around 30 or so, but it really varies on a case-to-case basis. One has to be cautious of two things over here: not going overboard and putting every possible KRI in on that list, because as I said, then you're losing out on your efficiency and the whole objective of the RBM strategy. And you're not focusing on what is critical. The other aspect is, what if you miss out important KRIs? Now, if you miss out on some important KRIs, the consequences could be very serious. Why? Because in the RBM model, you're really focusing on those data points where triggers are firing. So if you have missed out defining an important KRI, you could potentially miss out on an entire set of data points firing through the study for a specific parameter. So the planning aspect in the whole RBM model, I would say, is extremely crucial, and you have to be careful that you have got your act together in defining which are those risk indicators which are going to impact your study. Next slide, please. So like I said, don't overdo it. Be focused, be clear, get to the point, and get your KRI story out there. Next slide, please. So again, KRIs can be of two types. You could have leading KRIs and lagging KRIs. So so what's the difference between leading and lagging KRIs? Lagging KRIs are, you may say, more reactive. So basically, for example, you could look at, say, protocol deviations. So something that has already happened and it's telling you that this is a problem, and in future you want to address this and prevent it happening again. But something has already happened in a lagging KRI. However, if you're looking at leading KRIs, a leading KRI is more predictive and it's telling you the likelihood of something that's about to happen. Leading KRIs can be more tricky or more complex to identify. And you can have different examples of each. So like I said, for lagging KRIs, you could have an example of protocol deviations, or you could have an example of the number of serious adverse events that occurred in a study. But for the leading KRI, a leading KRI could be something like the number of unreported adverse events on a study. So now this is an interesting example, and I always like it because it could be an ideal example of both a leading and a lagging KRI. So you have a combination of these two that could come in. Why do you say that? So if you're looking at the number of unreported adverse events, why is it, could it be a leading lagging KRI? It could be a lagging KRI because it's something that's already happened. It could be a potential indicator of poor training of the investigator at the site and various other reasons. So that's how it could be a lagging KRI. How could it be a leading KRI? It could also be a potential indication of an investigator who's been trained well but does not want to report adverse events at his site. So it could be a suggestion of fraud that's happening at that site. So again, how you're defining or categorizing KRIs into leading or lagging is important. And as one goes closer to the actual event triggering out and the trigger firing, obviously the implications and the impact would be far more significant, as one can see over here. Next slide, please. So again, when you're looking at risk indicators, risk could be both internal to the organization or external. And when one is looking at risks that are internal to the organization, those are usually ones that can be more controlled. So what could be some examples of internal risks in an organization? Internal risks could be anything right from the training of your CRAs. It could be your existing policies which are impacting, your SOPs which are impacting, and many others which are actually resulting in something going wrong out there. And when we are looking, an external risk could be an example could be changing regulations. Largely, one doesn't have much control on the external risks. However, when one is looking at internal risks, they're usually more manageable. One again wants to look at addressing whether these risks are inherent risks, mitigated risks, residual risks. And when again, just to elaborate upon that, what do you really mean by inherent or mitigated risks, etc.? So inherent risks are risks that are kind of inbuilt within the system, something that you really can't do much about, you can't change it, and you may just want to accept it. Whereas when you're looking at a mitigated risk is, okay, now you know that this challenge is there, you're having a lot of, say, missing data and that's being entered, or data that's being not entered on time, or one of the other risks that's happening out there, but you've actually gone out and resolved it. Now, when you resolve an issue, you may not always have 100% resolution. And what you want to think about is what is your effort versus your ROI on that. So when you're looking at resolving that issue, you may say that you're going to accept some level of residual risk because the impact of that residual risk is not going to be significant anymore. So it is a thought out approach where you're essentially looking at how much of that risk do you want to resolve and how much of the risk is within the tolerance limits. Next slide, please. So again, when you have a KRI and you want it to fire, like as in we described it as a digital trigger, you have to define thresholds, right? And when you're defining thresholds, it's like your rag sheet, your red, amber, and green. So when you're looking at red, it's going into extreme or high risk, and it's not acceptable. Then you have the amber, which is basically moderate, and low, and finally it's green, where it's just fine. So when you're looking at the different thresholds of risk, the next challenge that basically comes into the picture is quantitating risks. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at quantitating risk, basically it's absolutely crucial to have clearly measurable objective parameters. Some amount types of risk may be qualitative, but as far as possible, it should be quantitated. Without measuring the magnitude of risk, there would be challenges that one would face in trying to assess the implications. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at risk, measuring risk, you have something called the RPN, or the risk probability number, which is basically a product of IPD. IPD is impact, probability, and detectability. So if the impact is higher, the risk is higher. If the probability of that risk occurring is higher, again, the magnitude of risk goes up, or your risk probability number, the risk score goes higher. And detectability, if it's easier to detect, remember that's an inverse approach. More easy it is to detect that risk, the lower is your risk probability number. This is standard methodology that was basically brought down from Lean Six Sigma days, FMEA methodology, failure mode effect analysis. But it's in principle something that can be applied across the industry, and it is being very effectively applied out here. When you're looking at key risk indicators firing, so you want to be careful about the number of triggers that are firing. Now, isn't it good if you have a lot of KRIs firing and telling you whenever there is a problem? Well, yes, it is, but no, it isn't. On the other hand, why not? Because you have to basically look at risk holistically. You might have one parameter which is telling you that there is a problem at the site, but you really need to do a deep dive. So it's not about training a bunch of central monitors, telling them, okay, this is your KRI sheet, this is your dashboard, and whenever a trigger fires or a KRI threshold is crossed, go and raise a query to the site. That is not the way one really wants to go about it for RBM. What one really wants to look at is to get an overview of what could potentially be causing that risk to fire, the trigger to fire. Is that KRI actually the issue, or is there something more deep-seated which is causing that KRI to trigger? So one is going to the grassroots level and being able to understand it, and for that, a deep understanding of the protocol, the therapeutic area, and the overall study is very important, and the right level of training to the team needs to be provided. The other thing is yes, I do see the comment over there that finding the right calculation for KRIs is a challenge. And I could just share on a slightly different note for a second is at Cyntegrity, we did work on creating a standard best practice document for really defining each KRI. And we have launched a KRI Wiki initiative, which I'm sure Artem will speak more about during his part. But what is so important is how are you defining that KRI? And the documentation of it is absolutely crucial. So how are you defining the KRI? What is the calculation behind it? What are the units behind it? What is the algorithm that is being used to derive that KRI? Why are you defining certain thresholds? And is that KRI dynamic? Do you need to revise those thresholds along the way? How do you get the data to measure those thresholds? There are a lot of brainstorming that goes into it, and the documentation and tracking of that. Is there any KRI going to be retired? Because at a certain point of time, there may be a protocol amendment, and you may want to stop looking at that KRI anymore. Or there's a new parameter. So you need to be very, very careful at what stage you have stopped tracking that data, or at what stage are you modifying or bringing in a new KRI. Coming back for a moment to complex KRIs. So sometimes you have a site which is really unhappy with you because you're really bombarding them with 100 queries a day. And you don't want to have your investigator simply resolving queries, especially if they are not relevant. Can you have complex correlated KRIs built together where you're assigning weightages to the individual KRIs and having a complex KRI which fires only when a certain combination of KRIs have reached an effectively combined level? It's not something that's very easy to do, and I think the industry is taking its time getting there, because it's not as simple as that, as just saying this is the weightage we'll assign, because there's a lot of thought process that goes around as to which KRIs are interlinked and what weightages should be assigned, how should the thresholds be co-derived. But though that's a challenge, that would be something that the industry would move towards, though it's not something that's very easy to do and needs to be done with caution. Next slide, please. So absolutely, when I always love to go back to driving a car. So when you're driving a car, if you're just not looking at your rear view mirror, it's quite possible that someone's going to nudge you gently from behind. And if you're not looking ahead, you could just have a head-on collision. So you can't afford to do only one of the two. You need to be able to scan the entire spectrum and look at risk in a holistic manner. You can't have one risk-based monitor or one central monitor looking at only certain aspects of the risk, and somebody else. It's sometimes we tend to make processes efficient and try to break up roles, but it is important in the process to remember that risk needs to be looked at holistically. Again, when we are looking at risk indicators, one needs to also factor in Co-KRIs. So when we are talking about Co-KRIs, what does one mean by Co-KRIs? So for example, if you're talking about patient recruitment at a site and you have a KRI that's firing saying that the number of patients recruited, say there were no patients recruited at a site within the first month, whereas at the other sites for that study, there were whatever, maybe 10 or 15 patients recruited. So, okay, so you have a trigger. I'm sorry, not no patients recruited, my apologies, no adverse events reported at that site. Whereas for the other sites, there are 10 or 15 adverse events reported during that period. And then so your trigger fires and you send a query to the site saying, why were there no adverse events reported? But does that even make sense? Because you also need to look at, were there any patients recruited at that site within the first month? So your risk was really not about not reporting the adverse events for that at the site, but the risk that lay at the site was about patients not being recruited or the data not being entered for the same. So you need to know that when you're tracking a certain KRI or a certain KRI is firing, what are the related or co-KRIs that you should be monitoring to have that holistic view of the risk. Next slide, please. So coming to the thresholds for each KRI. So there are two important aspects when you're looking at thresholds. Firstly, when should they fire? Is it easy to define those thresholds? It's always a complicated task in defining thresholds, and you usually have an upper limit and a lower limit. And as you can see that the moment you are moving towards the upper limit, the impact or the risk score goes up very significantly. So how do you define those thresholds? Is it all very straightforward, or do you just go about it in an arbitrary manner and say, okay, these are my thresholds, and just let it roll? So not quite. We need to have a frame of reference, and when one is looking at the frame of reference, there are different ways of going about it. So one is you look at his past data that you may have for your sites. That's one thing. Past data for the molecule or the therapeutic area, if you've conducted trials in a similar manner on a similar molecule or in a similar TA, then you look at existing industry standards that exist. You have associations like Metrics Champion Consortium, MCC, you have Transcelerate Biopharma, and a lot of these industry initiatives do publish data on related to this. So it's data that's gathered through experience. Now, once you've defined the threshold, is it something that will never change? No, it may certainly change. So a KRI to me is a living, it's like a living molecule, because even the KRI itself may be, as I said, retired, or even for a certain KRI, based on the way a study is moving and things are changing, even the thresholds may change based on what the industry is reporting. The KRIs may change. So that's the other thing. And the second thing is, when should the KRIs fire? Typically, you also need to correlate that to when your data is being uploaded. So if your data is being uploaded at a certain frequency, you also need to be cautious that that the KRIs are getting closed when they have been addressed. So it should not be the case that you have a KRI that is firing on the first load, for example, and you have resolved the issue at the site or whatever, whether it was a subject or site related issue, and that matter is resolved. And then once again, when the next data load happens, the KRI fires again. So monitoring that the systems are accurate, and that's where technology plays a key role along with the domain expertise. That is basically how one goes about, as I said, calculating the baseline. You're really looking at past data that you have. You're looking at published data that you have. However, you can also, through the course of the study, you may also redefine. If you have absolutely no data, you would try to base it on what seems logical to the best, but it may be redefined along the course of the study as you get more experience.
Yes, I just want to give a
next slide,
that
please.
We are halfway now, and we will attend to the questions during the Q&A, so that
hi, can you hear me?
Don't miss out any basic information. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Sure, we're almost done. Sure, Linda. Thanks. So coming to I was speaking about dynamic KRIs, and can KRIs really change? So yes, they certainly can. And why would the KRIs change? So the KRIs may change, because there was a protocol amendment along the way. So if there's a protocol amendment, you simply want to retire a particular KRI, or you need to bring in some new KRIs, or potentially because of safety findings that were reported during the trial, certain industry reports that might have been published, which makes you realize that there are certain important parameters that now need to be tracked. So what is most crucial in the process is documenting the point of change. Because if that is not tracked, I can actually give you examples where there have been major disasters when this is not tracked. It's absolutely critical to document the point of change from whether a KRI is being retired or a new KRI is being brought in. I think that was it from my side.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to intensify what Nimita has started describing the IPD score. So IPD, as Nimita mentioned already, was introduced in other industries already, part of Six Sigma, and for example, if NASA plans a rocket launch, it also assigns or evaluates IPD. So impact, probability, and detectability is part of our daily life when we are analyzing what risks to focus on. So as you can remember from Nimita's slide, the impact is not realizing immediately, but the longer the longer time passes by after the realization of the event, or materialization of risks, as we say it, the bigger impact is. So you can imagine that somewhere here happens a database closure. Somewhere here happens, for example, the FDA approval. So if an error or a risk is not realized, not found till that moment, then the impact might really escalate exponentially. So every event has kind of probability score. So analyzing the historical escalations of these events help you with the assessment of the probability. I give you a very simple example. If we would speak about danger to experience a crash, so to say, on our way to flying to some country, then the biggest danger that you experience is actually going by car to the airport. So probability of a crash during this time period, even if it could be a half an hour, it's higher than probability of a crash during the flight. So or the probability of to die on this sand beach from sandcastle is higher than to be attacked by a shark. So analyzing the historical values of events can help you to understand the real truth of probability and the real situation. So what is detectability? This is a kind of complicated construct which is always kind of challenged to explain or to understand. So detectability is how far in advance this event could be detected. Or how fast you can detect it immediately after the materialization. For example, if you have a house and in this house you want to be protected from fire, you can increase the detectability of fire happening by installation of the smoke detectors. And that's what happens in most of our houses. We install smoke detector to increase actually the detectability of the event. You can reduce the impact or by making insurance on fire. So in this case, you get protected from large financial loss. But of course, by installing the smoke detectors, you reducing the impact simultaneously on your health. For example, if fire appears while you're sleeping, so the impact in this case would be could be catastrophic. So if fire happens and you don't realize that. So both detectability, probability, and impact are properties of each of the risks and needs to be addressed and assessed separately using the historical mechanisms, using some special mechanisms, simulating data and analyzing the impact very rigorously. Speaking about the frequency of measurement is also a very interesting question, which usually comes from different of our partners. How often we should measure the risk indicators? So There are companies that measure it once in a study. There are companies that measure it, for example, every quarter. There are companies that measure it every month. And there are companies that measure it every week or even every day. So we are, from the frequency, we go to too foggy picture. So if it's very less frequent, not very frequent, so to say, to in a situation where there are lots of noise happening. So there is a golden middle here, and the frequency of measurement, first of all, it depends on this study, if the study is intense or less intense. It depends on this phase of the study. So in the beginning, you need to measure it more commonly, more often. It depends also on your ability to react, so, and your readiness, your understanding of the concepts. But usually we measure risk indicators every week, and I'm not actually, I don't feel that it's too often. And update the information, project management, central monitoring with the newest information every week. But again, there are studies where even everyday measurement are reasonable, particularly for some risk indicators like connected with serious adverse events, for example. So timelines of analysis is also important aspect. So the capturing the historical escalations of risk indicators is absolutely essential in my understanding. So you know the dynamics, how if the escalation goes, if the risk indicator goes up or it stabilizes or it goes down, corrects itself, absolutely important to understand for project management, for understanding the trend of the escalation, to understanding the seriousness of this. So as you can see, there are different examples here when a risk indicator corrects itself or corrects with the help of project management or central monitoring. Sometimes the indicator escalates and goes and stays in escalation mode whole study. Sometimes it goes on the boundaries of the thresholds. And as you can recognize with the color of the thresholds in the background, the thresholds adapt sometimes dynamically during the study. So it depends again on which risk indicator is configured and how it is used, because for some risk indicators it's important to analyze the dynamics of the whole study. For example, underreporting of adverse events is a classical example here. So when we start analyzing the rate of adverse events, we don't know yet what is the right rate. We can only assume. And this assumption is based on historical values, on analysis of the literature. But during the study, we see what is the rate of adverse events through all our sites. And based on this information, we can dynamically adjust the boundaries, the thresholds of risk indicators, and understand what sites are outliers here. And this methodology worked very well in the praxis during our during clinical trials. So we can always see the outliers in both directions. Sites that underreport adverse events and sites that overreport adverse events. For example, if they start reporting symptoms instead of diagnosis. So one of the biggest challenge we saw during also the polling, the question polling, is that KRI interpretation, and I'm absolutely agree that interpretation is the key to right actions. So how we advise to address this challenge? Actually, I could say nothing more than education, involving the staff from the very beginning, and explaining in very simple terms what KRI means, and using historical values, showing the case studies to monitors, to project managers, what escalations really mean. And really, when you build these case studies and connect them to reality, to real situations that they experienced, they will never forget it. So having it always takes time to create and analyze the historical values, but when you've done it, it helps you to explain what really does it mean. And I just want to give you a very simple example with a small video how different statistics might fool you, because actually so there was a very interesting experiment showing the differences in statistics. Or actually no differences. All these points that you see right now, they have the same statistical parameters. Standard deviation, correlation, every point right now which you see in different charts have the same statistical parameters, even this graph.
The key insight behind our approach
but they all differ, so the situation that they show is really different. Therefore, again, interpretation, looking inside of the data sets is absolutely crucial to understand what is happening. So don't trust only statistical parameters, always take a look inside. So defining the algorithms and calculations was already in the beginning a question about it, is always tricky, and we experience these challenges all the time, even after long years of doing the same tasks. For example, how do you aggregate the information after that? It already matters. There are different variations of aggregation, we always try to specify the risk indicators in very precise formula. Sometimes this formula is very simple, like this one, and sometimes this formula is really complex, like this one, but it still allows us to be very specific what is behind of the KRI in mathematical terms. And mathematics is allowing us to be a bit more precise here. Of course, again, explaining in simple terms is also very important. We have, as Nimita mentioned, we have generated a special guideline of a sound KRI specification, as we call it. What does it really mean to define this KRI? And these are the key points of this guideline. To define why KRI is important, provide a very specific definition. So connection to the risk, what risk is usually addressed. Type, leading, lagging. Sometimes it's leading for one event, for one impact, and lagging for another. So it's not black or white here. Calculation of KRI, particularly mentioning all the aspects of calculation. How to aggregate the information before, after. Do you use the mean values? Do you use the some average or mode or any other way of putting the values together? Do you use a window, time window for calculating that? If yes, then how long it is, how big it is? That matters as well. So defining the thresholds and assumptions behind of these thresholds. Also important, because you always start with some kind of assumptions, putting in the thresholds in the place, and then you validate your assumptions during your clinical trial, and in many cases you come to conclusion that assumptions were wrong. You just need to correct yourself. It's perfectly fine as long as you document the rationale of correction. What do you need to in order to measure this KRI? What data points you address? From what system these data points are coming? How commonly this information will be updated? It doesn't help you if KRI will be set up, but the information is not sent. Very simple example. In one of our studies now, reporting of adverse events to sponsor. So CRO reports serious adverse events to sponsor within 2 days, and it uses a special paper form, but it enters the information about reporting in EDC a couple of weeks later. So digitally, it's possible to recognize the delay in reporting of serious adverse events actually only when it's too late, only after 2 weeks of, or even more. Sometimes CRO forgets entering this information at all, completely. And this is also where none of the KRI will help you if there is no data behind, or the data is entered with a large delay. So always incentivizing sites to enter the data in timely manner is absolutely crucial. And even we use one of the risk indicator is timeliness of data entry. It's one of the crucial risk indicators in our studies. So what makes performance of a metric hard to achieve? Things you can do to improve the performance, some kind of already actions to mitigate the risk and actions to control the risk. Some companion metrics might be reasonable to have. So I will skip a couple of examples, sorry for that, but for the sake of time I have to speed up. So what happens when you recognized that the escalation happened? As I mentioned, we defined 2 steps. One step is investigational, so you start being a detective in a clinical study and analyze, particularly for such KRIs like fraud detection. Fraud is very big and complicated topic, by the way, which is very relevant for current studies, particularly in Asian countries. I don't wish to be biased here, but it was a publication recently in China. There was identified over 80% of data connected with some kind of misconduct and fraud. Again, as Chinese FDA made a lot of activities after that, but I'm sure this problem is not yet solved completely. So you are a detective in this case. You are analyzing what went wrong, and of course documenting your information when you identify the root causes. And it's always a combination of causes. It's never a one cause, a combination which resulted in the escalation. So you make sure that you document all of them, and then for each of them create a mitigation plan. And this will help you to analyze the frequency of escalations and focus on systematic issues. So again, don't forget that not only EDC matters, but other recording systems are absolutely essential. IVRS, CTMS, even finance or pharmacovigilance databases will provide you a lot of useful information for key risk indicators. And combining them in one intelligence layer will help you to approach the risk management holistically. and that's what we want to achieve. And when you drive your car, your board computer also gets accumulated information from all engine parts, from all the modules of a car, not only from the engine, but also from your brakes or and it accumulates and shows to the dashboard different escalations, different risk indicators, so that a driver of a car can address these escalations accordingly. So here we need to involve all the recording systems. LIMS is laboratory information or lab information and management system, I believe, something like this. So it's lab data. So I have really 3 minutes to close up. Again, addressing systematic issues, that's what matters. That's what GCP addendum asked us, and for that, such parameter of systematic nature of escalations matters. So there are lots of errors that happen, but many of them are random. They appear and disappear. And some of them are systematic. These issues, that's what you are hunting for. That's what you are looking for. These issues will improve your operations to 80%, 90%, and reduce your cost dramatically, because these issues are decreasing the quality of the data. And usually these systematic issues are connected with processes, are connected with people. So you need to address processes and people. And this is what you want to understand. So plan, do, study, act loop will help you in improving of these systematic issues. Just again, random issues are very hard to deal with. Systematic is that where you can achieve the most of the improvements. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides, and I'm sure that you will be happy to you will get the slides after that and can address them. So analyzing the trends and involving predictions is also a very useful mechanism, very useful tool right away today available for getting the more precise management of key risk
Artem,
indicators.
thank you for your very insightful
session. And
indeed,
Nimita mentioned our project. It's a non-profit project.
conversation
We
in the
invite
chat box.
everybody to
I
join
have
who
recorded all of
wants
it,
to
so
be
after the
part of
session,
something
together
bigger,
with the recording of it, we
to
can send the,
work on
whole
key
discussion that was
KRI
going on.
Wiki. So this
For
wiki
people who can't
consists
stay,
already from
please,
280
in the
key
chat
risk
box,
indicators with
enter your
specifications,
question. We will,
and we are going to
continue for
improve
another
and increase
5
the
to 10
number of risk
minutes,
indicators there
if there are
and
more
improve the
questions.
specifications.
Please go ahead.
And we wish to publish this Wikipedia at certain time point when it achieves a readiness state. So I wish to close my presentation with the piece of advice: never ever give up in your endeavor dealing with risk indicators, dealing with risk, because what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets done. So with these words, I wish to thank everybody for attention today, and we switch to Q&A session now, and I see that there are lots of questions already. I'm sure that many of them were addressed already on the way. So for those who couldn't stay for a Q&A session, I would I would say goodbye and say thank again for your attention.